Ontario's forests are dynamic environments that depend on natural disturbance for regeneration. Wind, fire, insects, diseases, all these forces, along with geology, soil conditions, and climate, shaped our ancient forests. With the presence of humans, our forests became subject to a new type of disturbance. While the indigenous peoples burned patches of forest to grow crops and encourage the growth of wild foods, after only 100 years of European settlement, we'd removed most of the forest from the southern regions of this province and significantly reduced tree cover in many other areas. Today, thanks to science, hands-on experience, and traditional indigenous knowledge, we have a much better understanding of forest dynamics, and we're starting to realize that our future depends on the future of healthy forest ecosystems.
When I go into a forest now, any forest, I'm thinking about how those trees became established. Many of them are hundreds of years old, so they've been there much longer than any of our living people that are alive today. So you have to think about trees in their life cycle and try to think about them 100 years from now. So history becomes important as a guide to what the future forest might look like.
In the early 19th century, Britain had her eye on our forests. She was at war with France and needed the timber to maintain her naval fleet. Napoleon had cut off Britain's supply of timber from the Baltic, and the virgin red and white pine stands of eastern Ontario became a strategic resource in support of the war effort.
In the 1800s, we have the Napoleonic War, and Britain is cut off from a supply of timber, especially softwoods from the Baltic, and she turns to Canada, particularly up in the Ottawa Valley. She'd gone to the U.S. before the Revolution to get masts for the Navy, and she came to New Brunswick and even up into Ontario for masts for the ships. And this was the beginning, really, of the timber industry in particularly Ontario and eastern Canada generally.
At the same time, land clearance for settlement was actively promoted by successive colonial governments. Generous incentives were provided to entice immigrants to this region.
When the settlers first arrived in this part of the country, the forests were pretty much unbroken. This area was a very heavily forested area. It was broken up by wetlands, of course, but the settlers themselves viewed this forest as something that was almost evil and intimidating. It was impenetrable, and if you read some of their journals, they just couldn't believe how shaggy and ragged the forests were, and it was dark. The light didn't hit the forest floor, and they were afraid of it, and they were intimidated by it because they now had to clear it in order for them to establish a house and a garden and have their family survive.
For the first European settlers, the forest represented an obstacle that needed to be overcome. Their land grants required them to clear 12 acres within the first 5 years or forfeit their title. It was backbreaking, dangerous work, and many of them had never swung an axe before.
The forest would have been massive. Elms would have been huge, towering, maybe probably over 150 to 200 centimeters in diameter. White pines were also of that size. You could get 5 16-foot logs out of the thing before you even hit the crown. That's incredible, the size of the trees that they had back then. And yet it was just manpower and horsepower that was available to take those trees down.
Gradually, the settlers cleared more and more land, sowing their crops of wheat and barley amongst the huge stumps in their small fields. To buy the necessary staples for their families, they needed cash, so they used fire to burn the large beech and maple. The resulting mountains of ash they turned into potash, which was sold to Britain for the pottery and textile industries. The fire was frequently used by settlers simply as a land clearing strategy. When these fires got out of control and became major forest fires, they ran into conflict with lumbermen who were after the big pine.
There are stories of settlers using fire in a reckless way, and the result would have been large conflagrations that would have burned large areas, widespread areas. So the lumbermen were quite fearful of settlers pushing into their areas.
The lumbermen were also responsible for the huge fires that raged through this region at the time. Squaring timber was a wasteful process. About 30% of each tree ended up on the forest floor. This provided dry tinder for the natural and human-caused fires that burned through previously logged areas. While these fires were a danger to the people living and working in the forest, they weren't the primary concern of the forest industry at the time. For them, the greatest challenge was getting their timbers to market thousands of miles away across the ocean. For that, they relied on the network of rivers and streams that crisscrossed the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest.
The square timber era was really about how to transport that material from the hinterlands of the upper reaches of the Ottawa Valley all the way up through the Muskokas and even north into Temagami, to drive that lumber to markets over in England. You know, the Ottawa Valley is famous for that, of course. The guys putting together square timber, so you would have had to have fallen the tree. You would have had to have squared that timber in the woods using hand tools to exact specifications. You know, and I don't know how they did it, but they made nice squared cants of white pine, dragging that out then and then getting it to a lake, driving it down to where they could put it together as a raft on the Ottawa River, and then shooting the rapids of the Ottawa River at the time, right past Parliament buildings, all the way to Montreal and even on to Quebec City, where they finally loaded that material onto boats and then it was shipped over to Europe.
Forestry was a cornerstone of our economy. At the height of the square timber trade, millions of cubic feet of pine were being rafted annually to Quebec City and from there mainly to Great Britain. In the second half of the 19th century, timber exports brought in 4 times the revenue of agricultural products. Virtually all of this timber was coming from the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forests, as licenses were acquired further up the Ottawa River and its tributaries, and then into the Lake Nipissing and Georgian Bay watersheds. The timber industry became our largest employer.
The logging industry really drove the early economy of Canada. It provided the money that allowed us to build some of our original, institutions like the Parliament buildings or Queen's Park and some of those other things, some hospitals and schools. That came from revenue that was derived from logging.
By the end of the 19th century, many of the biggest and best pines had been removed, and the square timber trade with Britain was almost over. The last shipment of square timbers left Montreal in 1908, but trade in new products took its place.
So now the economic incentive for the square timber trade in Canada is dying back. But at the same time, you had the rise of a new market, the Americans, who were starting to encounter shortages of white pine and good lumber in the sort of northeastern United States and the Great Lakes area that was undergoing significant growth at this time. And they started looking north, and we were their providers, and we became their providers, but it was a new product. We started sawing up the logs into lumber.
The bandsaw, it transformed the industry, and lumber was the big production, initially to Britain again, but then with the burgeoning development in the United States, there was a huge market for lumber.
These opportunities attracted families like the Shaws and the McRaes, who came to Renfrew County from Scotland. The businesses they started at that time are now being managed by their great-great-grandchildren.
John Shaw and his wife Barbara, they came from Scotland, and they settled at Snake River by Lake Dory, and it's amazing how they started out and even the facilities that they built. There's a dam that was built, and then they had a water-powered sawmill that had a circular saw that they They sawed lumber, and they did a lot of custom sawing.
We trace our sawmilling heritage back to my great-great-grandfather. His name's J.D. McRae, John Duncan McRae. And his parents immigrated from Scotland. And he sort of started into the sawmilling business for us. He originally had timber licenses in the bottom end of Algonquin Park. This is in the early 1890s. And unfortunately, the history kind of had to stop a little bit because everything burnt down. The whole town of Eganville burnt in the early 1900s. I think it was 1911. So his son then, my great-grandfather, had to sort of start from nothing again. And he purchased a sawmill here in Whitney in, I think it was 1917. And we've sort of been in the Whitney area ever since.
Business soon picked up for these small sawmills, as railway and road infrastructures opened up new areas for harvest not easily reached by rivers. Hardwoods like maples and oaks that didn't float well were now also available. Sawn lumber could be packed and shipped easily in rail cars. Railways were also important for the new pulp and paper industry. But at the turn of the century, new technologies allowed paper to be made from wood pulp rather than rags. It was in the northern boreal forest that the pulp and paper industry would have its greatest impact.
Our spruce species, especially black spruce in northern Ontario, had the type of fibers that were ideally suited to making newsprint. And so there was a lot of relationships between a pulp and paper mill and a newspaper chain. So like the Spruce Falls mill in Kapuskasing was the primary supplier for the New York Times.
The mill was the lifeblood, and it was an employer of thousands of workers. Today, if you go into a pulp and paper mill, you see somebody sitting behind a computer, and they're checking out the whole system, and the machines are running faster than they ever have, producing more than they ever have. But flash back 100 years to 1917, and you go up to Iroquois Falls, or you go to Pine Falls in Manitoba, you go into a paper mill, and there are 1,000 workers. People walking around barefoot because very few safety standards at the time, but it was also a slippery floor whereby you had the best traction was using no shoes.
The pulp and paper industry would become one of the great industrial engines of the Canadian economy for the next 7 decades. At the same time, pulpwood production meant that more of the land base was available for logging and a greater diversity of trees could be harvested. Settlement and timber harvesting had degraded Ontario's forests, and the impact did not go unnoticed. Forest fires raged across many parts of the province. Mineral extraction in the southern Canadian Shield had cleared large areas and left them prone to soil erosion and fire. Meanwhile, land clearing was spreading northward through the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, fueled by government settlement policies.
The government had one objective. It wanted people on the land. It wanted settlers. It didn't at that time in the area for settlement, they weren't concerned really about the timber.
James Little was somebody in the Ottawa River Valley who'd been a timber baron in that area for decades. And by the 1870s, he's starting to write reports about the need to manage these areas, to start tree planting, to start thinking about restoring the forest and taking a longer term vision to it. And again, he could be criticized, he was just motivated by economics because he was running out of timber nearby. But these, oftentimes it's the fear of economic doom that leads people to adjust their behaviors and their attitudes. And so he was one of the first voices who started speaking about those issues.
Government finally listened when lumbermen and foresters together voiced concerns about the last remaining stands of mature white pine in the province. They wanted them protected from land clearing for settlement and the human-caused fires that often followed these activities. As a result, Ontario created its first forest reserve in 1893 on lands that would later become Algonquin Park.
At one point in our history, there was a grouping of people that were located within what is now modern-day Algonquin Park. And the establishment of the park meant that the government of the day had to eradicate the Algonquins from that area.
Our earliest records show that back in about the 1830s, there was forestry activity and logging beginning in Algonquin Park, the area that was before Algonquin Park. So it was really approximately 50 or 60 years after that, in 1893, when the park was created. And there was some government visionaries at the time in the late 1880s, around that time period, that saw that with the settlement going on outside Algonquin Park, land clearing, areas being cleared, that perhaps a park would be very useful here to protect the forest area from development.
We've actually had forest licenses in the Algonquin Park area since before Algonquin was a park. So we've been in the forest industry on this piece of land since the early 1890s, so 1890 and 1891. Algonquin Park became a park in 1893. So we predate the park by a couple years, and we've been harvesting on the exact same land base ever since then.
Many of the logging companies of the day, they were actually quite supportive of the concept of the park being developed, because at that time the park wasn't intended to prevent logging. It was actually seen as a way to ensure that a forest would remain in this area.
The idea at the time was to have a multi-purpose area in which people could go up and they could recreate and they could fish and they could camp, but also harvesting would go on and other activities as well, and also to protect the watersheds that originate up in the Algonquin Park area, to ensure that they remained in tree cover.
Reserves were about more than just trees and recreation. Wildlife and fish populations were in decline and were to be protected as well. The location of the Algonquin Reserve was chosen because it protected the headwaters of 4 major river systems.
That's where the clean water is, and that's where our responsibility begins, is just to keep that water clean. And we still, to this day, we still use it in a traditional way. We realize now, or we've always realized, that is not only significant to us, but it's significant to all people from Ontario.
In southern Ontario, in the early 1900s, deforestation became a serious problem, and people realized something needed to change. The land had been covered with a mixture of maples, elm, beech, and American chestnut. The farmers had removed the trees in order to sow their crops and raise their cattle. As a result, some areas became wastelands, as the light, fertile soils blew away due to a lack of protective tree cover.
Deforestation became a huge concern in southern Ontario. By the early 1900s, you had areas that were experiencing desertification. They were experiencing dropping water tables. They had blow sand areas whereby sands would be as much of an impediment to travel by horse and buggy in the summer as the snowdrifts were in the winter.
And there's pictures of stumps, pine stumps, that were stilted with, the original soil layer. You could see where the root color was, and 6 feet of stilted roots exposed with no soil underneath. That's how much soil was being moved around. So we went from, a pretty robust primeval forest very quickly into what could be now considered to be a bit of an ecological disaster.
The need to protect Ontario's forests was the driving motivation of Edmund Zavitz, a trained forester who would later become Ontario's first chief forester. Through his efforts, the first tree nursery was established in southern Ontario. Seeds were gathered, small seedlings were planted, and a whole reforestation program was launched to try and stabilize these wastelands. Some of the best examples of red pine plantations in Ontario are a result of these early stewardship efforts. In the first decades of the 20th century, Canada's economy experienced a sustained economic expansion. Demand for wood and agricultural products put increased pressure on Ontario's forests.
You had a pulp and paper industry that was well established. Again, it's a world leader especially in terms of newsprint. Major presence in the boreal forest. You had the lumber industry across the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest region. So these are major industries, and then you hit the Depression and you go into a tailspin.
During the Depression years in Renfrew County, the sawmills were one of the only sources of paid work for people of the region. At the time, the Shaws were fortunate to get a big contract with the Bell Telephone Company for the delivery of poles, needed to supply a growing number of households. To this day, that contract remains a big part of their operation. Like the Shaws, the McRaes have weathered both good and bad times.
I think that's one of the things I've always been pretty proud about our family history, is that we've weathered depressions and recessions, world wars, up and down market prices, and a variety of other external factors, but we've managed to stay true to our passion, which is sustainable forestry.
Pressures on the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest continue to increase out of pure economic necessity. When it came down to a choice of saving the woodlot or cutting and selling the timber to feed your family, the choice was simple. By the late 1930s, land clearances in the southern counties of eastern Ontario had reached almost 100%. The outbreak of war in 1939 completely changed the role of government in the forest industry, as Canada became Britain's supply depot for vast amounts of wood product.
Then along comes World War II, and you have a huge uptick where we became Britain's ranking ally by mid-1940, and we are looked at as a supply depot for so many materials that Britain needs and the Allied war effort is in dire need of. And lumber would have been one of the major products.
We cut a lot of yellow birch to make the panels for the mosquito fighters, and decking for a lot of warships, the wood stock for the rifle butts. So demand was really high.
So that was a huge boon to the Canadian forest industry, and that would have accelerated harvesting again and having a larger impact on the landscape, more species being harvested in a broader area.
The war effort forged a new relationship between government and the forest industry. Previously, governments had played almost no role in the management of the forests. Legislation was limited, and the companies did all the work. Now, a steady supply of wood products was needed, and it became the responsibility of the Federal Department of Munitions and Supply. The whole wood production stream, from stump to mill to seaport, was examined, and inefficiencies and bottlenecks rationalized and streamlined. After the war, with Europe in ruins and a building boom at home, our natural resources were needed more than ever, and the partnership that worked so well in wartime was continued.
I mean, this was a golden opportunity for us to emerge as a world leader in terms of providing the globe with forest products, and we did that. During 1945 to 55, the Canadian pulp and paper industry operated at or above 100% capacity, which means we can't keep up with demand, or at least in terms of newsprint. So this was an era during which the world would buy literally as much as we could produce.
Pressures to supply a booming market, the need to make the industry more cost-effective, and a post-war labor shortage led to innovation and the development of new technologies in the way trees were being harvested. Our famous brawny, axe-swinging lumberjacks heaving down the pine were being replaced by loggers with gas-powered chainsaws.
Canadians became innovators and in terms of mechanization. So that gentleman who used to, or a three-man crew that used to cut pulpwood, now they were using a chainsaw, rudimentary chainsaw, or they were driving a skidder. So now they're able to cut exponentially more wood than the three-man crew would have done before. And so you had higher productivity, but fewer workers needed.
Trees could be harvested more efficiently, with fewer men, and at less cost. So for the next 2 decades, government and industry would concentrate on making sure we did not run out of trees. Companies were required to submit annual and long-term cutting plans. At the same time, the Ontario Department of Lands and Forest embarked on its first comprehensive forest inventory. They soon realized that our trees were not regenerating naturally fast enough to meet demand.
So in the late 50s and then into the 1960s, Ontario began a major program of building nurseries in the north. And it was an exciting time because we were doing things that hadn't been done before. And the nurseries growing seedlings in containers. They produced 20 million seedlings in 1 year in what were called plastic tubes. That was the beginnings of the new period of forest management in Ontario. We had other elements of it, the inventory, but this was the real beginning of establishing new forest. And it was an exciting time.
By 1962, the post-war reorganization of forestry was complete, with the roles of government and industry defined in legislation. In the forestry profession, it was a time of enthusiasm, energy, and activity. In the forest industry, the world would buy everything we could produce. Canada and the forest industry were looking forward to growth and prosperity. Canadian society would change dramatically over the next 2 decades, and attitudes towards forests and forestry would change as a result. A post-war baby boom generation was growing up with a different set of values than their parents or grandparents. It was this younger, mostly urban generation that would play a major part in changing the way we manage our forests today.
During the 1960s and 70s, you had increasing urbanization in Canada. Persons are living more and more. Our population's living more and more in cities and urban centers. We've talked about mechanization in the forest industry. So fewer people are actually working in the forest. These towns and mills don't need that many people. The woodlands operations don't need that many people. So more and more of these folks are living in the Golden Horseshoe, or they're living in the Quebec-Windsor corridor.
The other thing that happened was, I think people started moving off the farm. So originally, if you were a farmer, you understood the value of wood. But as people started moving off the farm and into cities, they started to become disconnected from the forest.
Well, even though the forest industry remained a huge part of our economy and played a huge role in our economic well-being, the number of persons directly dependent upon it is declining at the same time as people are having a less and less direct contact with the forest.
With little direct experience of forests, it was the arrival of television into these suburban households that would first shape the attitudes of a new generation. What Canadian youth growing up in the 60s and 70s could forget the immensely popular television series The Forest Rangers, with its backdrop of scenes set in Ontario's great outdoors. Shows like these, along with films like Helicopter Canada and North of Superior, considered the most widely seen Canadian IMAX film, created a visual and highly romanticized vision of the North, a vision that would become an essential part of a generation's Canadian identity. The rapid rise of a suburban middle class with time, cars, and money meant that for the first time, many Canadians were using the forest for recreation in the new provincial and national parks. In 1954, Ontario had 8 provincial parks. By 1960, there were 72, with over 5 million visitors each year.
Once Highway 60 was constructed through the park, that really increased the number of visitors, campers, tourists coming to Algonquin Park. So it's about that time that there started to be somewhat of a conflict between recreationalists and the logging industry, who generally had free reign of most of the park before that.
Your experience with nature might be a trip to the cottage on the weekend or for 2 weeks in the summer. And during that experience, you want nature to appear as it does in your mind's eye. It's not a clear cut or a cutover. It's not stumps. It's beautiful, verdant trees that are flourishing.
Problems arose when the media constructed image of forests clashed with what people were experiencing and seeing. And the concerns were not just with Algonquin Park. Throughout cottage country and other parts of the province, young people were questioning what was happening in their forests.
And as a young man, I was quite an outdoorsman. I was out there all the time, and I saw clear cuts that were devastating. Like I remember they used to pile the logs for scaling reasons in those days. That's the measurement reasons. They piled them 16 feet high. So I would scramble up on top of a 16-foot pile in some of these clear cuts, and you could look as far as you can see. There wasn't a standing twig or tree, which the year before there had been a great forest. You didn't have to be an environmentalist, whatever that is, back in the 70s to realize something was going wrong in the forest. And that led to, in the Boreal, the huge outcry against the giant clear cuts.
The population of Canada had a right to stand up and question how these publicly owned forests were being managed. This wasn't somebody's private woodlot. This was to be held in a public trust by politicians. And so they had, everybody, I think in Canada, every citizen had a right to stand up and question what was going on and to ask for better management.
It came to confrontation in the woods because something had to change.
And they'll be replaced too. It's not going to end. We're here to stay.
Indignation and outcry grew gradually. When the confrontation came, it happened in one of Ontario's most scenic and iconic regions, an area that typified the beauty of the Canadian Shield as portrayed by Tom Thomson and other famous painters.
Algonquin Park was the battleground for so many of these disputes between loggers and recreationalists, same in Temagami later. But these are what people would think of as old growth stands or beautiful stands. And it's interesting where they occurred because they didn't occur at that time on the boreal forest. Generally speaking, the backlash wasn't in areas that had aesthetically unpleasing trees. People weren't hugging spruce trees in black fly-infested swamps in northern Ontario. They were in aesthetically pleasing areas that were beautiful to the eye and what they conceived of as being valuable about nature.
I think with the awakening of the environmental movement, I think that the people back then were starting to realize that the holistic view, which is something that's held by Aboriginal people, it became more important. People started to see that it was, the ecosystem was something that we were all just a small part of.
The Red Squirrel Blockade of the late 1980s brought together environmental and First Nation activists in peaceful protest against the logging of Temagami's old-growth pine. At the time, the blockade was the largest act of peaceful civil disobedience in Canadian history. Over 300 people were arrested. The groups that were protesting became adept at using the media, conveying their messages in a visual way that appealed to people's emotions and tugged on their heartstrings. As a result, the protests led to broad public support for regulating the industry in a way that reflected new societal values.
Undeniably, the environmental movement was fundamental in improving our stewardship in the forest. The politicians who make the regulations governing forestry practices, they were forced because of that demographic to shift how the forest would be managed.
That movement, that whole, save the old growth and clear cutting is bad type of movement, it did two things. It really cut to the soul of a lot of forest communities who had, many generations that had grown up as loggers, and they would all have stories about how, well, my father logged in this forest, I'm going back to that forest to log it again, and my kids, I want them to follow in my footsteps. So loggers were all of a sudden evil. Foresters, same thing. We're committed to sustainable forest management, and yet the word forester became synonymous with someone that you could not trust.
And the irony in many ways was these foresters for years had been suggesting and recommending and proposing, let's manage the forest properly, and there was a lack of political support. During the 60s, especially early 70s, you had the rise of public support for good stewardship, but at the same time, the foresters had lost their legitimacy because they were being labeled as the persons who had been part of this industrial conspiracy to harvest the forest.
Much of the public had lost faith in anyone involved in forest management. What they didn't know was that for many years, professional foresters in both government and industry have been calling for a more sustainable approach to managing forests. The University of Toronto, which began its forestry program in 1908, was graduating young foresters in the 1970s ready to take on the challenge.
I first became involved in forestry in 1973, September, when along with 120 other students, I stood in line at the Faculty of Forestry at the University of Toronto to sign up for the forestry program. And I enjoyed the program so much that I stayed and did a master's degree and a PhD in habitat management. And I've been involved in forestry ever since. As far back as I can remember, forestry has always, in my opinion, had a very strong conservation ethic. And that was one of the things that was so appealing. We learned that the forest is much more than just the trees and the wood, that the forest is a community of interacting organisms. And when we manage the forest, we're managing a community. We're managing an entire ecosystem.
In the 1960s, the post-war policy of managing solely for sustained timber production evolved into a policy of managing for multiple users. For the first time, the needs of other users of the forest would be recognized in forest management plans. By the 1970s, the young cohort of foresters trained in ecology and biology would begin to implement a more ecosystem-based approach to forest management. For them, like society in general, forests were much more than pine trees and portages.
The idea of how forests should be managed, it was an evolving idea because there were all sorts there was lots of new research being done. There were people with new ideas about how we should look at the forest, more like an ecosystem, more like a community rather than just only a source of wood. So the whole process of providing habitat for wildlife through forestry has evolved step by step since way back then.
The single biggest change in the 1960s and 70s was the introduction of tree marking, because that took the decisions straight to foresters and technicians, making good decisions on the ground about what to cut, what to leave, how to protect wildlife, and how to protect forests. And that's a program that we have continued with to this day, and it's a great legacy of that time of the 60s and 70s.
This was the era of featured species management, where the thinking was, well, let's select a few species to focus on, and maybe if we make the right selection, the right choice, these featured species will sort of capture the requirements of all wildlife on the landscape, and we'll be able to, in a manageable way, sort of provide for them all.
Out of this new science arose the need to integrate other values into the forest management planning process. Not just recreational use, but non-timber values like wildlife and aquatic habitats, soil and water protection, and ecological values like old growth. This new approach was called Integrated Forest Resource Management. Perhaps the earliest large-scale application of integrated forest resource management was the development of a master plan for Algonquin Park in 1974. While logging would continue as part of the park's original mandate, the new master plan would protect and enhance a long list of other values. The Algonquin Forest Authority, a Crown agency, was created specifically to manage the forestry activities in the park.
In our forest management plan, we have certain areas of concern, and one of them is canoe routes and portage routes and campsites. So we try and stay away from those areas from the Canada Day weekend to Labor Day weekend, just to sort of protect that sort of, aesthetic value and, the noise and that sort of thing.
So forestry is only permitted within a portion of Algonquin Park, within the recreation utilization zone. It makes up approximately 63% of Algonquin Park, but when you factor in other no-cut reserves, rocky areas, other inoperable areas, it really is about 51% of Algonquin Park is eligible for forestry.
While the general public welcomed the changes, the local forest industry and the people who worked for it were concerned about maintaining their timber supply. Many of them relied on a wood supply from Algonquin Park to stay in business and provide employment to the people living in the surrounding communities.
Every single job here is 100% dependent on the wood that comes from Algonquin Park. But there's a catch to that in that it makes it that much more important to us. It makes every person here, their livelihood and their children's livelihood, because everything is multi-generational. We depend on Algonquin Park.
So the AFA was brought in. Now I was very young, remember sitting around our kitchen table listening to the press releases and listening to my father being interviewed and trying to explain that we weren't here to decimate Algonquin Park. We were here, it was our backyard. Nobody had more vested interest than we did.
The sawmills lost their timber licenses in the park, but they did not lose their supply of wood. The newly appointed Forest Authority was required to ensure that each company received its fair share. By this time, Canada was inescapably part of a global environmental community. And many Canadians wanted Canada to be a leader. Yet this same global movement was highly critical of Canada's environmental record and wanted us held accountable. At the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, the nations of the world were called upon to endorse sustainable development, and that included the management of forests.
When you started to be held up to a standard that was worldwide, it wasn't as easy to blend into the background, that you would be held accountable. And I think Ontario, Canada in general, but Ontario in particular, was being held up to that standard, and it had to be accountable for it. And there had to be a commitment to improving what was going on. So it was, I think, a reflection of the bigger environmental forces, the environmental movement forces that were at work during those years.
The Earth Summit produced a statement of forest principles, all of which would have implications for forest management here at home. Social, ecological, cultural, and spiritual values were to be given equal weight with economic ones. Governments were encouraged to find ways that local communities could participate in the planning process. Indigenous rights were to be protected and supported. And the statement explicitly endorsed the protection of examples of unique ecosystems like old-growth forests.
So what happened was, although the world was changing how they were going to run forestry, Ontario was first off the mark to actually grasp all these new concepts and create a whole new way of thinking about forests, the Crown Forest Sustainability Act.
And the Crown Forest Sustainability Act was actually a groundbreaking, very advanced piece of legislation, because it said that what we must do in the course of managing forests for wood products and so on is we must emulate natural landscape patterns. That means forest types and structure and so on. And we must conserve ecological processes and biological diversity. So we had to do it all.
Sustainable forest management would be based on two science-based principles. Large, healthy, diverse, and productive forests, along with their ecological processes and biological diversity, would be conserved. Forest practices would emulate natural disturbances and natural landscape patterns, while minimizing the adverse effect on plant and animal life, soil, water, and air, and economic and social values. These were not new concepts, but this is the first time they've been entrenched in legislation. The Act changed other things as well. Social, economic, and environmental needs would be given equal value in forest management planning.
And I believe it's still the only piece of legislation in Canada for forestry that includes sustainability in it. And it's looking at the forest not simply in terms of the economic value of harvest values, but seeing it as a whole, an ecological whole, and managing for all of the values that encapsulates, including humans as part of the ecology of the area.
I think that when we look at the impact that Aboriginal traditional knowledge has on the sustainable forest or the sustainable management of forests or anything, that we have to look at it from a wider angled lens. We have to look at Western science and Aboriginal technical knowledge, and they have to be both given the same weight.
Over the 40 years, some remarkable people have done some remarkable science, and we understand more and more and more about the complexity. And at the same time, we move closer and closer and closer to the Indigenous people's world, what their traditional worldview is. It's really quite startling for something. I just find myself so close in interpretation, different language, different, concepts of things, but ecologically, we're becoming converging on this Indigenous people's view.
Now that we're fully participating in forest management to the extent we are, that we're able to bring both voices to the table, and we're dealing with people that are more open to understanding those practices.
The Crown Forest Sustainability Act was a comprehensive rewrite of Ontario's forestry legislation and the culmination of 3 decades of societal change and advances in forest practice. It defined forest sustainability and put the forest first. It entrenched public consultation and the roles of Indigenous communities, and it redefined the roles of government, industry, and the public. Government would write the rules and ref the game. The rest of it was up to industry and the citizens of Ontario.